Hello. Welcome to Happy Nightmares. In this story, a boy and his father try to escape as pale, bloodthirsty creatures emerge from the earth. We hope you enjoy. It shivers.
It was late when he heard it. 9-year-old Jaime Kramer had been sitting quietly on the basement sofa. Something was on the television, but he wasn't really watching. Normally at this time, he would have been nose-deep in a mystery or thriller from his father's bookshelf. Usually James Patterson or Michael Connelly, but not tonight. Tonight his parents were fighting, and that meant he needed something with a little more volume. Jaime didn't care what they were arguing about. The few times he thought to listen, he had been very disappointed by the subject matter. A dish that had thoughtlessly gone unrinsed before being placed in the rinsed-only side of the sink after dinner, perhaps. Jaime, a child still waiting to progress physically, but further along mentally than most kids his age, had decided that sometimes adults just needed to argue. Unless they were bickering about something directly related to him, which was a rare occurrence, he had no interest in eavesdropping. The TV was able to almost drown out the yelling, but it could not compensate for the loud thud that shook the ceiling above him. His thumb smashed the mute button on the remote control and the TV went silent. He looked up instinctually toward the sound of the noise and realized that everything had gone quiet. There was no yelling, no fighting. The house was silent. Had this coincided with the noise? He couldn't be sure. Part of him wanted to stay on the couch, to turn the TV back on and pretend that he heard nothing, or to pick up the book that lay open but upside down on the couch next to him, and do what he really wanted to be doing in the first place. But another part of him understood that something was wrong. Still gazing at the blank white ceiling, Jaime climbed to his feet and began to make his way toward the stairs. About halfway across the room, another loud thud shook the room once again, and he stopped walking. His mouth had gone dry. He tried to call out, "Mom? Dad?" But nothing came out. Jaime started walking again, a bit slower than before, and eventually found himself at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the closed door beyond which should lie a quiet night at the only house in which he had ever lived. But something else was up there. The argument had not been bad enough for Jaime to think it might have turned into something more. He knew this because the television volume had only been on an 8, and he needed at least an 11 or 12 to drown out the really bad arguments. An 8 fight would not have resulted in a physical altercation, especially when, to his knowledge, his parents had never laid a hand on one another outside of the typical daily contact, which seems to be necessary when two people are in love. No, something else was making those sounds. A telephone hung on the wall above the light switch at the bottom of the stairs. They had one of the last landlines in the neighborhood. At least it seemed that way within the confines of a 9-year-old's mind, where the 2 or 3 houses he had actually been inside automatically mirrored every house in existence. For a moment, he considered picking up the receiver and dialing 911. He even raised his hand within an inch or so of the black plastic, but then he pulled it back. He knew nothing. Had no idea what was upstairs, if anything, and if he was wrong, then the police would arrive and succeed only in waking his finally sleeping parents. Then they would have a reason to argue about him, which was not something he wanted to give them. Instead, he curled the fingers of both hands inward and clenched them into soft fists. Then he began walking up the stairs. By the time he reached the door at the top of the steps, he had talked himself out of the worst-case scenarios he'd been able to come up with, and reached for the door handle without hesitation. As his small hand came to rest on the cold handle, a new sound entered his ears, coming from just on the other side of the door. Jaime looked down at the dim bar of light glowing from underneath the basement door and made note of 2 dark breaks in the light. What he heard was breathing, but not normal, steady breathing. It was also not the slobbering breath of a monster or beast, which Jaime had already crossed off his worst-case scenario list. It sounded like the quickly wavering breath of someone who had been out in the cold without sufficient coverings. Whatever it was inhaled and exhaled quickly, without any break in between. Both inhale and exhale shuddered equally, as if its owner was shivering uncontrollably. Jaime's mouth hung open and his jaw began to tremble. He wanted to take his hand away from the door, but found himself unable to move. His eyes were fixated on the 2 shadows, and as he watched, one of them shifted slightly. It was a jerky movement. The same shadow jerked again, and then suddenly the shadow's owner was gone in a series of rapid footsteps. The soft slap of its feet against the linoleum told Jaime that, whatever it was, had no shoes on. Jaime waited, breath caught in his throat, for a few minutes before slowly turning the door handle. The Kramers maintained their home, and so the basement door swung into the hallway without a sound. Jaime stepped off of the staircase and into the hallway, but stopped when the door hit something abruptly, stopping it short of opening all the way. He looked down and saw a thick red substance creeping toward him from beneath the halted door. Jaime began taking slow steps backward, down the hall toward the kitchen and away from the basement door. He knew it was blood, and somewhere inside he knew that the blood must belong to one or both of his parents. But his mind would not accept this realization yet. When he reached the threshold of the kitchen, he turned and entered the lit room. That was when he noticed the footprints on the floor. It was as if someone with dirty bare feet had been running all over the place without purpose. Jaime's eyes followed the winding trail like a maze in one of his highlights magazines until they culminated at the back door, which hung slightly ajar. A thick strip of darkest night shone through the open space between the doorframe and the door, and while he desperately wanted to be out of this house, Jaime's mind had no trouble stirring up all sorts of madness which could be waiting for him in the constant shadow beyond that door. A loud crunching sound caused Jaime to spin back toward the hallway, and he watched as the basement door began to swing slowly closed, bumped by something on the other side. Despite the sleeping hinges, Jaime's mind conjured up the typical haunted house door creak as he watched in horror. The hall was dark, allowing only a faint yellow glow by the light from the kitchen. It was enough to see the shape of his mother's body lying motionless on the dark wood planks of the hall floor. Crouched over the body was a thin, naked shape, with gray skin as translucent as tissue paper. Jaime could see what appeared to be black blood coursing through trembling veins all over the creature's entire body. But the more he looked, the more he realized that the veins weren't trembling. Rather, the thing's entire body was shivering violently, as if unable to control its excitement. Jaime could hear chewing, and finally managed to take a step back, away from the nightmare in front of him. The darkness of the night suddenly seemed very inviting. He took a second step back, and the upset floorboard whined loudly beneath his weight. The chewing stopped, and the thing's head slowly rose in Jaime's direction. Tiny black beads blinked upon its ghastly face, and beneath it, a gaping hole of a mouth filled with tiny teeth which appeared to be shivering independently of each other, and the now even more violently trembling body of their owner. A faint, high-pitched squeal began to rise from deep within that open throat. Blood coated the bottom half of its face. Jaime turned to run for the back door, but as he did, the door began to sway inward, and from the darkness beyond a second being emerged, paler than the first, but without the blood-stained jaw. This one's mouth was closed, which rendered it nearly invisible, leaving only the black beads to break up the white-gray canvas of its face. As this one made its way up the back steps and set foot inside the kitchen, Jaime got a good look at its size. It stood only a few inches taller than his 9-year-old frame, but in his eyes the creature seemed to tower above him menacingly. It took slow, jittery steps toward him. Cold fingers suddenly landed on Jaime's shoulder, and when he turned, he saw the first being stood inches from him. Blood dripped from its jaw. Its beady eyes blinked once, and Jaime bolted through the kitchen toward the living room. The high-pitched squeal rose louder behind him, and he glanced back. He only saw for a moment that the pale figures were crouching to give chase, and shivering almost to the point where he could not see them clearly. Jaime didn't dare stop running again. He rounded through the living room and back into the foyer, intending to make for the front door. Through the tall, thin windows on either side of the double front doors, he saw more pale faces, more beady eyes, and redirected to the staircase. He ran without thought, 2 steps at a time, not knowing where this trail ended. Jaime made it up the stairs and turned toward his bedroom door. His foot caught on something, and in his haste was sent sprawling across the carpet. He looked back and saw one of the creatures lying on the floor, motionless. A gaping open wound leaked from the left side of its skull. "Dad!" Jaime called, and instantly he heard thudding footsteps coming up behind him. A warm hand wrapped around his mouth, and he was pulled back into his bedroom. The shock of this took his breath away. Then Jaime was thrown into the room, and he heard the door slam. He watched as his father shoved Jaime's bookcase in front of the door, and then stood up to face his son. Jaime ran to him, and as his father fell to his knees, they embraced. "Jaime, we have to get out of here," his father said. "They're outside, Dad." "I know, but I think we can get to the car." He released his son and stood up, and then walked over to the window, picking up the stained baseball bat he'd dropped on the floor. Jaime followed, elated that he no longer had to make these decisions for himself. His dad would take care of him. His dad would make sure he was safe, even if his mom... His thought was cut off as he stood next to his father looking out the window. White bodies stood at various distances from each other in their yard, and their neighbor's yard. Jaime could hear screams from the distance. In some of the yards, creatures were crouched over bodies, neighbors who had tried to escape and failed. "Listen," Jaime's father said softly. "We are going to climb out of this window and onto the roof. We will walk along the roof to the side of the house. Hopefully, there are none of them in the backyard, and we will be able to drop down inside the fence to get into the garage. I have the keys, and we can take off. Okay, buddy?" "But Dad," Jaime began, his voice wavering as reality began to bypass the barriers of fear. "What about Mom?" Jaime's father took a very deep breath, but did not answer Jaime's question. He had one job right now, and that was to get his son away from this terror as quickly as possible. He reached forward and slid the window up. He slowly removed the screen, not wanting to draw any attention if he could avoid it. "I'm going to climb out first, and then I'm going to help you out," he spoke in a lowered voice. "When we get to the edge of the roof, I will jump down and then catch you when you jump. Understand?" Jaime nodded, and then watched as his dad put one leg through the window and then pulled himself the rest of the way through. He took Jaime's hand and guided him through the window after, and then they were walking along the slanted roof toward the side of the house. Jaime looked out across the yard at the creatures just standing there, shivering with anticipation or excitement or whatever. Then Jaime noticed all of the holes in the ground. There was one next to each of them, and some that had been abandoned. He remembered the dirty footprints all through his kitchen. Jaime recalled his mind's image of the creature as it came through his back door, and its gray skin, and thought to himself that the skin wasn't gray, it was white. They were dirty. They had come out of the ground, and they shivered out of hunger. Each was patiently waiting its turn to feed, and if they were spotted, there would be no escape. Jaime's father slowly lowered himself over the side of the house, and Jaime heard him drop to the ground with a grunt against the impact. If he was hurt, he didn't show it, and quickly whispered for Jaime to follow suit. It was a long drop. Jaime did hesitate for a moment, but then he saw the urgency in his father's eyes and lowered himself over the side as well. He hung from the edge for a moment, and then closed his eyes and dropped. His dad caught him with ease and lowered him to the ground. Cautiously, his father opened the side door into the garage. It was pitch black inside, and Jaime knew his father worried they might already be inside. He fumbled for the light switch and knocked something over in the process. It clattered to the floor loudly, and as soon as it settled, they both heard the high-pitched squeal that began to rise from their front yard. The lights finally came on, and they both saw nothing in the garage. "Jaime, go!" his father shouted as he ran to the driver's side of their four-door Toyota Camry, parked in the center of the garage. Jaime bolted around the back end of the car and climbed in the passenger seat. He had always sat in the back, but this time he did not want to be back there by himself, and his father did not seem to have a problem with it. "Buckle up," his father said, as he started the car. Jaime buckled his seatbelt and grabbed hold of the armrests. Then, after another deep breath, his father reached up and pressed the button on the fob clipped to his visor. The garage door began to open. Jaime wanted to turn around and look, but instead he shut his eyes tightly. His father watched, mouth dry, in the rearview mirror as he saw the shivering bodies moving toward them, mouths opening and closing hungrily. Once the garage door was clear of the car, he slammed it into reverse and crushed the gas pedal with his foot. Tires squealed, and Jaime shut his eyes tighter. The rear bumper of the car slammed into the first one with a hard thud, and the car bounced violently as it backed over the broken monster. 5 more of them fell victim to the Camry before they even reached the end of the driveway. They hit at least a dozen more as they careened down the street through the housing addition, and then the creatures began to get out of their way. Before long, they were on the highway, cruising at 70 miles per hour, and tears were leaking steadily out of Jaime's father's eyes. Jaime didn't know where they were going, and he wasn't sure his father did either, but it didn't really matter. The highway was loud, but just for a moment Jaime thought he heard a faint, high-pitched squeal, and his breath caught in his throat. Then he relaxed. They had crossed the bridge, and once it was behind them, the squeal had stopped. Tires on the highway, nothing more. Jaime closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the window. His father glanced over at him, and more tears streamed from his eyes. He had tried so hard to protect his son. He'd been sure they had escaped. It had taken everything in his power not to scream when the cold fingers closed around his throat. And then again, when hundreds of tiny teeth sank into the back of his neck. He kept his hands on the steering wheel and his foot on the gas. Slowly, he began to increase their speed. There was a bridge in the distance. Massive cement supports sprouted from the earth to hold it up. They were wearing seatbelts, and the occupied creature in the back seat was not. As they approached the bridge, his eyes flicked to the side for one more look at his son, now soundly asleep beside him. He began to feel faint as the shivering thing drained him with long, sucking gulps. Time was short. Calmly, he began to turn the vehicle away from the center line of the highway. He closed his eyes, and in his mind he saw his wife on their wedding day. Her eyes were smiling at him from behind a massive bouquet of daisies. He smiled and let go of the steering wheel. "Everything's fine," he said softly. "Everything is going to be okay."
Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Come back soon, and, as always, happy nightmares.